Coming up next, we welcome to our studios Robert Parry, Washington correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Last week, he was in Miami covering the arraignment of General Manuel Noriega, and he joins us now to talk about his reporting on that story.
Bob Parry, Washington correspondent for Newsweek. You just got back from Miami. And this week's issue, which has a cover of General Noriega on it, you write about the Bush-Noriega relationship. What is that?
Well, it's something that we don't really have all the answers on at this point, but clearly we know that, that there was a relationship, particularly between General Noriega and the Central Intelligence Agency, and President Bush, before he moved on to be vice president, and then president, did direct the CIA in 1976. At that time, and then later, as vice president, George Bush did have contact with General Noriega.
Fred Kemp has a piece, part of his book in this issue of Newsweek, saying that General Noriega got $110,000 a year. How long did that go on, do you know? Well,
that was, there were different levels of retainer for General Noriega. He was at first paid much less, and there's still some dispute over exactly what his salary was. Some of that may have been money he was given to pass around to his associates in the Panama Defense Forces. But he did receive substantial sums from the Central Intelligence Agency.
What did you do in Miami?
Well, I covered the case a bit, talked to some of the attorneys, and mostly did a lot of writing.
What did you find down there?
Well, in talking to the attorneys, it became clear that they will make an effort to show that General Noriega has secrets that he can spill, and that they will try to make it a difficult case.
A lot of reporters?
Oh yeah, it was a mob scene.
How do you get any individual and new information when you're down there in a mess like that?
Well, I always dislike the mob scenes. As the kind of reporting I do is better done one-on-one or on the phone even. When you're in that kind of a situation where there are dozens of reporters, maybe hundreds, all you can basically do is get to the events and listen to people talk. And often that is not the best way to get news.
One of your competitors, U.S. News, chose to put the photo that you all put on the cover inside. What do you think of the government releasing this photo?
Well, I think it's pretty routine to release photographs of suspects when they're incarcerated. It is obviously demeaning to General Noriega, and that probably is one of the points that was to be made by the government.
So some suggestions were made by people who are not happy about it that it may cause difficulty for getting a fair trial.
Well, this trial will be very hard to conduct in the sense of getting an impartial jury. This is not like the North case in the Iran-Contra affair, where you had a great deal of pretrial publicity, but it wasn't all negative. Many people liked Colonel North. Very few people liked General Noriega. You also have the unprecedented situation of American troops having gone into battle, some of whom died, to bring this man back to the United States to face these charges. It'd be a very hard choice, I think, for a jury to decide to find him innocent with that kind of a background.
Where do you go with the story from here, you personally?
Well, I think it's still very important to try to nail down precisely what General Noriega does know about U.S. intelligence and his relationship to President Bush. That is still, in many ways, not well known. We have many cases where there were meetings or documents possibly exchanged, where the secrets have remained fairly tightly held. And if you saw General Scowcroft on one of the talk shows yesterday, there's still a lot that even the government apparently does not know, or at least does not want to share at this point with the public.
What happens if General Noriega is tried and found not guilty?
Well, I think if he would be like most people, he'd have to be released from American custody. Whether or not he would then be returned to Panama is a bridge we'd have to cross at that time. Whether the Panamanians would want him, whether there'd be an effort to extradite him back to Panama, it's hard to say. Clearly, if you were General Noriega, you probably would want to go elsewhere.
Grand Rapids, for Bob Parry of Newsweek. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I think you're doing a wonderful job. I'd like to start by saying that. I have a couple questions. Number one, I do want to put a plug in for Bush because I feel a lot more confident with him running this country with the knowledge he does have from his previous experience. What I am really waiting and anxious to hear is what Noriega is going to say about his contacts here in the United States, and I would like to see the press try and get some information from him prior to the trial, because I'm real anxious to see how the Bush administration is going to handle that feedback, and I'm also real concerned about them. I understand the need for the control of the cocaine, but if we bring it to the United States, what kind of effect that's going to have? So I'm curious about those three things.
Well, on the first point, there were two key meetings that George Bush had with Manuel Noriega. One was in 1976, when George Bush was director of the Central Intelligence Agency. That meeting is still pretty much a mystery. There are some pieces about it we know. We know that the CIA at the time was very disturbed with Noriega because he had been taking U.S. intercepts for his own purposes, either to sell them or to provide intelligence to his government's leadership. There were also indications that at that meeting, George Bush enlisted Manuel Noriega in spying on the Cubans on our behalf, since the Cubans were using Panama as a way to get around the U.S. trade embargo. The United States wanted the Panamanians to provide us information about what the Cubans were up to. So, but there's still some mystery as to exactly what occurred at that meeting. There was a second meeting, which occurred in December of 1983, where the then Vice President met with Manuel Noriega and two other officials from the Panamanian government. At that meeting, as best we can understand, there was a discussion of the money laundering issues that were of interest to the United States, and as well some discussion about Nicaragua. The aides to Noriega claim that it was at that meeting that Noriega was persuaded and enlisted to help out with the Contra operations in Nicaragua. But President Bush has still not responded or explained exactly what occurred at those two meetings. And the U.S. side has been very resistant to go into those kind of details.
Carson City, Nevada, capital of Nevada. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian. My question is, was it worth 29 lives, or 20-some American boys' lives, and about 300 and some wounded, that the Veterans Administration probably will never take care of, and yet you could justify the invasion of Panama when you got a couple of hitmen out of Vegas for about $25,000, and they'd have disposed of him in a hurry, and probably even cheaper than $25,000.
Bob Parry.
Well, there are people in the U.S. military, particularly the special operations people, who do feel somewhat like that. They feel that it should have been a much more targeted operation, one that aimed at simply getting Noriega and possibly some of his top command and either bringing them back or killing them there. Obviously, the president chose to go with a different option, which was to use essentially mainline conventional U.S. forces supported and assisted by the special operations people, but with largely an invasion with massive firepower to overwhelm the Panamanians and to secure Noriega that way. It's hard to say which would have been better. Clearly there may have been fewer deaths, but there may have been more too if you went the other way. Once the decision was made to go for Noriega, I think the fact that you would have American military casualties was almost certain.
Independence, Kansas. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was wondering why yesterday on CNN they were talking about an attorney general that went down to Panama to investigate human rights violations, and he's come back and saying that at least 4,000 soldiers died down there, and maybe up to 7,000. I'd like to know why nobody's reporting things like this.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case of soldiers. I think what is being discussed there are civilian casualties. There were a large number of civilian casualties that were inflicted during the invasion. What happened was that since Noriega's forces were often in headquarters close to these civilian neighborhoods, when the United States went in with fairly heavy firepower, there were attendant civilian casualties. Now, the exact number has been a point of dispute. The president and his advisors have said that even to this date, there are no good figures. Others have gone down and suggested that the number of civilian dead ran into the hundreds and possibly much higher. But I think the figures, the best we can determine at this point would be in the 150, 200 range of civilian deaths.
Your magazine says so far 250 bodies have been recovered. Of these, 151 were buried in two common graves, one of which contained 124 bodies, and the other 27 bodies. The graves were dug for public health reasons because there were too many bodies for the Panamanian morgues to handle. This is in this Periscope this week in Newsweek. What did you personally think when you saw Ramsey Clark making the statement that there were thousands killed? Do you believe him?
Well, it's not a case of believing or disbelieving. I was not down there. I did not see what had happened. Clearly, there were whole neighborhoods that were devastated by the invasion. In that sort of situation, you are going to get widely varying counts on civilian deaths or wounded. And frankly, I have not reviewed Mr. Clark's statement with any precision to know exactly what he did say.
Franklinton, Louisiana. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Mr. Parry. Just one question. Do you think that the media organization's debt structure would undergo any impact if any of these major media undertook a serious investigation of the American banks that were represented in Panama and the alleged handling of the drug money and laundering of it?
Interesting question.
Well, I think it's a good point to say that there are American financial institutions that don't have entirely clean hands on the issue of money laundering. It is a difficult area to get into, and not just because of the people are very powerful and wealthy and could cause you trouble. I'm not saying that's not a factor at all, but it is also the case that money laundering is a very hard story to get into because it's complex, because it is hard to determine, I think, with any certainty whether people who deal with drug money often know what they're dealing with. There are huge sums of money that are being transferred around the world, and for each banker to know what the origin of each batch of money is very difficult to expect. That is, that's no excuse in some ways, but it does, I think, show how hard it is to get into that kind of a story and do so with the kind of confidence that you'd like to have.
Next call, New York City. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Brian and guest. Thank goodness for C-SPAN. We definitely need these kinds of forums in order to get the American people to participate in the governance of this country. Now, I have 2 points to make about the Noriega situation. One is, it seems to me that the press has been effectively muzzled in their coverage of the taking of Noriega from Panama. The information that you and the people in this country are getting is in bits and pieces. There doesn't seem to be an overriding understanding as to what actually has happened in Panama. And the second point I have is, it seems to me that we have taken a leader of a sovereign nation from his territory. He is a Panamanian citizen. What kind of jurisdiction can the American courts have over this man? And I'm quite sure his lawyers will make that their first priority.
His lawyers have made that point. In fact, they've already filed motions, or they filed motions more than a year ago, on exactly that point. Their argument was that there was a principle in international law of head of state immunity, that one government cannot go into the country ruled by another government, whether we like them or not, and seize their leaders and bring them back to stand trial. Obviously, if that were done in a widespread fashion, you'd have international anarchy. The Justice Department, however, has taken a position that in cases involving drug trafficking or terrorism, when the country that is the host country, let's say, for the suspect is not cooperative in returning that suspect for trial, the United States is now claiming the right to go into that country and seize that individual. Obviously, it's not something that would be the first choice, but it's something that the United States government is asserting as a right. The U.S. government is probably on rather shaky grounds in terms of international law, but it is what the U.S. government feels is necessary to fight what I think most Americans agree are serious problems of drug trafficking and terrorism.
Garden Grove, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian, I'd like the guest to comment on two things, please. We've heard nothing but Panama City, Panama City. There's another city, a large population center, Cologne. We hear nothing from Cologne, and I wonder why. And the second thing is the coup that occurred 2 or 3 months ago that supposedly our intelligence didn't know was coming off and that we did not support. And I'm wondering if the people that led that coup were not our guys, as the saying goes, and so consequently we didn't trust them or go along with them. I think we had intelligence on that coup coming up. I don't think we were ignorant, intelligence-wise, of that event. But why didn't we act on it? Really, why didn't we? I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, I think it probably was, as you suggest, that these were not our guys. The president said at the time that he felt that we did not have a good handle on who these people were, what they were up to, that it was not part of an American plan. And he would have preferred some kind of American solution, at least in terms of working with Panamanians who had been enlisted for that kind of activity, or at least who the United States had confidence in. The U.S. clearly did not have confidence in those coup makers, at least not in the time frame that was required for a response. It will probably be a difficult historical question whether or not the United States should have taken that opportunity to have, even if done so in a very hasty manner, to throw its support behind the coup makers. It might have made the necessity for an invasion a couple months later moot, and maybe we could have saved some lives as a result. But the decision at the time was that the United States did not know what it was getting into and didn't feel that that was a wise approach.
Any idea why we haven't heard more about Cologne?
I think the press coverage has still been fairly limited, as we've seen. We've seen complaints from some of the American reporters who were on the Pentagon pool. The Pentagon pool was set up after the Grenada invasion because American journalists were not allowed into Grenada to witness the actual fighting. The pool was set up so in the event of another U.S. military activity like this one, American reporters could be on the ground, see what was happening, report back to the American people to explain what actually occurred, not just what the Pentagon wanted us to know about. That did not work well. The American reporters were taken down and essentially shown around by Pentagon public relations specialists, shown basically what the Pentagon wanted them to see. As part of this, they did not get a chance to go out in the countryside very much or really do much independent reporting at all. Reporters have gone in since then, and why they've not reported about Cologne, I really can't say. Obviously, the focus has been Panama City, and there are only so many journalists, and many of them are stuck with the main story, which would be what's happening there.
Bob Parry is originally from Hartford, Connecticut, is a graduate in English from Colby College, spent 12 years with the Associated Press, and has been at Newsweek since 1987. Got his start at Middlesex Daily News in Framingham, Massachusetts. Columbus, Georgia. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I got a question about these military personnel, the one that was killed and the one that was assaulted. What circumstances are around these people being killed? And also, I was in a Ranger battalion. I just recently got out of the service, and we trained in Panama, and we had 2 days R&R down there. And I can tell you, if Noriega got into the drug trade, it was only to supply the military personnel down there with drugs, because everyone I saw down there was using drugs. And also, there was a case about a year ago of military personnel stationed down there importing drugs to Macon, Georgia, and then transporting it to New York. I was wondering if there's any ties between the military down there and Noriega, perhaps importing drugs together.
Well, on the first point, the point about the circumstances that led to the invasion, there have been some reporters who have looked into that, and I think the story appears to be pretty much what the Pentagon initially said it was, which was that there was this carload of American Marines who were out going out for dinner in the evening, and they made a wrong turn, and they ended up in front of the Panama Defense Force headquarters, one of the most sensitive places in Panama. A crowd seems to have gathered. There seems to have been a bit of a confrontation, and the guys in the car panicked, sped through the checkpoint, and were fired upon. This does not seem to have been a premeditated effort by either side. Later on, in terms of justifying the invasion, the administration did argue that this was a murder of an American Marine and that it therefore justified intervening to protect American lives. But what seems to have been the case was that this was more of a situation that evolved out of the tensions and the hostility that had been growing on both sides over a number of months and even years. As far as the roughing up of the American serviceman and the threatening of his wife, that too came at that same point, at the same time frame, and seems to have been a kind of a spillover. Whether or not this was part of any orchestrated effort seems unlikely. But it does seem to reflect that the hostility was growing from the point of view of the Panamanians toward the American servicemen down there.
In Fred Kemp's book, Divorcing the Dictator, which is excerpted this week in Newsweek, and the book will be published in March, he writes this. Then just 3 months after Bush took office, he learned that the Army had launched an inquiry into Noriega's misadventures, details of which might embarrass the Ford administration. This is when he took office at the CIA, and caused the GOP long-term political damage. Codenamed Canton Song, the investigation revealed that Noriega, Panama's chief of intelligence, had been buying reel-to-reel audio tapes from members of the Army's 470th Military Intelligence Group, which conducted the high-tech eavesdropping throughout the region on behalf of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The 470th was specifically tasked to tape Panamanian officials involved in canal treaty negotiations, and on and on. I mean, we're going to see a lot of this, you think?
We'll see some of this. I think there are, as I say, many things that have not come out about Noriega's relationship to the United States, and some of them are very sensitive. Perhaps the most sensitive will be the involvement, or the alleged involvement, of the Vice President's office in 1983-84 with the Contra resupply effort. The way Noriega's aides have described this is that after this meeting in December of '83 between Bush and Noriega, Noriega stepped in and provided more assistance to the Contras. Some of that, according to these allegations, was coordinated out of the Vice President's office. The Vice President's office and and Bush's top advisors at the time have denied that. They have claimed that they had no relationship to the Contra resupply effort. They have so sworn under oath. If it turns out that in fact there was a serious involvement of the Vice President's office in the Contra resupply operations at that time, which was when Congress was trying to prevent assistance from going to the Contras, it could mean serious trouble for some of Bush's former top aides, many of whom are still in the government. And if that's the case, that could have then a spillover effect to cause embarrassment and possibly serious political trouble for the president.
Newport Beach, California. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, good morning, Brian. I don't hear you all that well. I hope you hear me. I want to sort of throw a couple things on the table for comment. I wonder what your guests and probably your callers would think if, Eisenhower said he looked forward to a world of law, which, clearly we don't have. But if both Mr. Noriega and Mr. Bush were tried in the World Court in The Hague, individually, of course, I wonder what the outcome would be. Secondly, I see a long-range implication of this, the U.S. policy, and I'm sure that my fellow yahoos in Orange County don't give a damn, but I think that world opinion is more and more important in terms of even our country, and I think that there's a scenario that says that Gorbachev and Russians, particularly European Russians in Europe, would become a more cohesive type of an arrangement, both economically and politically, and I could see the United States becoming a larger version of South Africa in the international scene. That is more and more isolated because I'm sure the people of Europe, most of the people of the world, just look at the United States having done this as being an international gangster.
All right, thank you. How about George Bush at the World Court?
Well, obviously, we might have some trouble in justifying, in terms of at least the intricacies of international law, this action. The arguments, the basic arguments to justify it, that people have given most credence to, were the protection of American lives, one, and two, the protection of the Panama Canal. There are probably good arguments that in fact those were overreaching by the government, by the U.S. government in terms of a legal justification for this action. However, this was a case where there is no doubt that the United States has significant strategic interests in Panama with the canal. And there's no doubt that this was an unusual case where a dictator had operated in ways that were very heavy-handed and offensive, certainly, to the American public and to its government. But whether or not we'd have a good case, or the U.S. would have a good case in the World Court, I think is an interesting issue and one that has not been fully explored.
Huntington, New York. Go ahead, please. Huntington, New York, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, sir, you're on the air.
I can barely hear you.
We can hear you.
Good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
I want to talk about the Panamanian adventure, which obviously is very popular with the American people and with the Congress. And I'm appalled by the fact that there's such indifference to the cost of this operation. From what I understand, we've lost 23 young lives, several hundred injured, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Panamanians. I understand 20,000 homeless. I read an estimate of $2 billion in physical damage in Panama. This has got to be, by far, the most costly criminal manhunt in recorded history. The irony of it all, to me, is that while this has been going on, the world has observed successful, peaceful revolutions in Eastern Europe against far more despotic regimes. Might this not have been the case in Panama if we were not so trigger happy?
Bob?
Well, I think Americans, and I think the U.S. government would have been much happier had the Panamanian people risen up and taken matters into their own hands, as we've seen occurring at great risk in Eastern Europe. That is a difficult question. Why didn't the Panamanians take on Manuel Noriega themselves, as the Filipinos did against President Marcos, as the Romanians did, as other countries, other people of Eastern Europe did? And they did that with risk, and many of them, in the case of Romania, died. Why the Panamanians waited for the United States to intervene is a difficult question, and I don't quite know. I think Noriega, while he was clearly a human rights abuser and clearly a dictator with a very bad reputation, which was well-deserved, was not known for any mass murders, was not known for a mass attack on his people. But they did not seem to organize in that fashion, and perhaps they were waiting for the U.S. to invade. And that certainly has been the case in some countries where they would just as soon have the United States do that hard work for them.
As we take our next call, we'll look at the covers of this week's news magazines. Bob Parry with this one. Let's go to Los Angeles, California. You're next.
Good morning.
Morning.
2 quick questions. One, I'm wondering how long the American public is going to have to stipulate to the aspect of being fair to this man. The word fair does not apply to this individual, both from a legal standpoint and several other aspects of dealing in the cocaine business.
All right, Bob Parry.
Well, the fact of the matter is that under the American Constitution, which will be in a sense, the operative situation that Mr. Noriega will be tried under, a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and the United States cannot waive those kinds of requirements of our legal system, no matter how despicable any one individual might be. So I think he does have to be presumed innocent in the sense of a trial. He does have to be assured the kind of protections that we have in our legal system. It'll be difficult to find an impartial jury for much of this because of the points made, I think, by the caller. But the federal judicial system must make that effort, as they have in other difficult cases. There have been plenty of drug dealers who have been prosecuted under federal law, and Manuel Noriega will just have to be one of them, and he has to be treated much as the others have been.
Great Falls, Virginia. You're next.
Hi, I'm calling from Great Falls. Good morning.
Morning.
I see and hear, listening to some of the previous callers talk about the Panamanian civilians, victims, a stunning semblance or a similarity to the way the Chinese handled the disposal of the students in Tiananmen Square. No individual identification of lost individuals, open grave, mass graves you described, the lack of numbers, the lack of information about how many died. It's frightening. I really think there's any fairness in press coverage on this subject that our situation, what we did to the Panamanians, will eventually be judged as equal to what the Chinese did to their citizens in Tiananmen Square. That's my comment. I'd like to hear you respond to that.
Well, I think there has been criticism, and from people in the U.S. military, about how certain parts of this operation were carried out. I've talked to particularly people in the special operations sections who were appalled that such massive firepower was used against areas where there were many civilians. The United States did use aircraft, it used artillery. It did so to overwhelm the Panamanian Defense Forces. However, it was not at all discriminate in the sense that I think most military observers would like to have seen. There were a number of civilian casualties, and the United States probably inflicted the bulk of those. It also seems fair that there be an effort to determine exactly how many died and what the circumstances were, but that's a very hard thing to do when you're trying to deal with a battle situation. As I think the article points out in Newsweek this week, that there were some of Noriega's people who were dressed as civilians. They were mixing in with the civilian population. It's an extremely hard, it's a hard question to resolve, but it's one that I think there should be more effort at, and I agree with the caller that this should not just be considered a minor footnote. The United States government, I think, also has tried to play down this part of it because of what could be negative public reaction to civilian casualties.
Escondido, California. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, my name's Greg Soda. My question is, given the odds of sending the Americans into Panama and knowing that there would be casualties, why, instead of going to that extreme, just instead sending a couple of like hitmen in and taking him out? Because the fact is, like, I feel like the president just did that so he could get recognition of some sort instead of just going in and, like, I don't know if Noriega is going to get the death penalty or the gas chamber or what you guys feel you're going to do with him, but I think it would have been a lot easier just to send a couple hitmen in and take him out and be done with it and not have all those tragedies through the American people's families and some of the Contras families, the innocent people there in the streets and all the problems that come of this.
Thanks, caller. You had that same question at the early part of the program.
A quick point you might make, though, is that it may sound odd, but it is a violation of American law to engage in assassinations. It is not necessarily a violation of any kind of law to engage in a military operation that can have a number of casualties. But there were good reasons why that prohibition on assassinations was put into place. The concern was if the United States could be accused or in fact engaged in assassinations, that could come back to haunt the United States, that if we can kill someone else's leader, they might think they can kill one of our leaders. And clearly the United States has gone through tremendous tragedy because of the assassination of political figures.
San Juan again. Go ahead, please.
I'm Dr. Mendez from San Juan. I'm very preoccupied about the American invasion in Panama. I'd like to know if you have any concrete evidence about his drug trafficking and all the other crimes that he's accused of by the federal grand jury.
Thank you.
Well, concrete evidence. I mean, there are witnesses who come forward who had worked with General Noriega, who have testified before the grand jury, alleging Noriega's involvement with drug trafficking. The case is not as strong as I think some legal observers would like. The witnesses themselves have, in many cases, been convicted drug dealers. Some of the people who have not been convicted drug dealers, but who were, say, former Noriega assistants, have been accused at different times of fabricating other stories. So it is not the strongest case in many ways legally, but I do think the evidence is fairly persuasive that General Noriega was involved with drug traffickers, and in a way to protect them or launder their profits and so forth. The evidence, I think, is strong enough to say that. But it's going to be a difficult case in some practical ways, as well as some of these more esoteric legal issues. We will see, perhaps, in one of the tremendous oddities of this case will be that the Drug Enforcement Administrator, John Lawn, has publicly praised General Noriega for his assistance in fighting drugs. There have been letters written by the DEA praising Noriega and his government for its cooperation in fighting drug trafficking. And Mr. Lawn actually maintains that position to this day. So you could almost see John Lawn being called as a defense witness in a case where you have some convicted drug dealers acting as the prosecution witnesses. So there are some practical matters that, in terms of this case, that will be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt certain areas of guilt. But there's also the chance now that with Noriega out of power, others will come forward who know more about his activities and testify, or that documents will be discovered that will shed more light on what he was actually up to.
Time for 2 more calls. Miami next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
I have one question about Noriega. You know, it seems to me that Bush put a lot of emphasis on bringing Noriega back to Miami or to South Florida alive for trial, right? That was the major emphasis of the 4 points. What troubles me is this. We've been losing the war on drugs. Everybody knows it. I believe Noriega is going to be used, although he is a bad guy and was in drugs, although he was a relatively minor player. But he's got good front-page news, and I believe he's going to be milked for PR for George Bush and William Bennett. The trial is going to be long. Everybody knows it. It's going to be constantly in the front pages, probably. I don't know what's going to come of what he knows about Bush or whatever, but I believe he's being used.
Well, I think to some extent that the caller is right. The General Noriega is not considered to be a major drug figure in the sense of some of the leaders of the cartel. He is accused essentially of assisting them with money laundering, providing protection, providing a basis of operation for them. But he is not generally regarded by those who follow these questions as himself a major drug trafficker. And as I pointed out, there is even this conflicting evidence that he cooperated with the Drug Enforcement Administration in arresting a number of drug traffickers. So I think the point is fair that this is not the kingpin of international drug trafficking. But whether or not the intent is simply to milk it for publicity's sake, I'm not sure I can agree with that.
Tacoma, Washington. Go ahead, please.
Yes. You know, this has opened up a can of worms that this is really bad for American jurisprudence. Think of all the kids going to law school and think about what they're saying right now. And actually, this goes back way to the 1900s when they set up segregated money changing lines in the commission down there. I think they were paying off in silver or gold or something, and they had one for blacks and one for whites, and it started right from there. Now we have people in the community saying that this was planned a long, long time ago, and that when they promoted General Colin Powell into this, they did it to take some of the ease and heat off. They know that the fallout was going to be behind this. We live here in America under one law, which says that no officer of the law can break the law to protect the law.
Bob? Well, I think that point is correct. We're not, the federal government is not supposed to violate the law. But I'm not quite sure what the suggestion was. If the suggestion was that General Powell was put in as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to make this possible, I don't really understand that. But clearly, I think that President Bush found a change in the military command, both at the Southern Command in Panama and in the Pentagon. It enabled him to move forward with military options. The previous leadership, both in Southcom and at the Pentagon, was much more resistant to committing American troops to Panama. And it was with the changes that we saw in the last year or so in both areas that the military option rose and became more acceptable and more likely, and was clearly carried out, I think, by most estimations very effectively. But it was an option that was made possible by many of the changes we've seen in the military.
Brattleboro, Vermont. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning. A couple of very quick points. One is it sometimes sounds as though there's going to be President Bush put on trial down in Miami and not Manuel Noriega. Secondly, I think the reason why there was a military strike was an assassination would not have neutralized the PDF, which could have caused a great deal of problems, both for the U.S. and the Panamanian people. I think sometimes it sounds as though the press is more on Noriega's side than on the government side. And then lastly, there seems to be a lot of second-guessing on the press's part, and you hear a lot of comments on what we should have done this, that, and the other thing. I wonder if maybe some of the people in the press ought to get into government where they could really make some decisions if they know so much.
Well, I don't know what exactly the point is, but the press, I think, has been generally very fair on this on the issue of covering Panama. There have been complaints inside the government, which the press has reported, raising doubts or questions about certain aspects of the operation. I think overall the press has fairly responded and reported that by and large the Congress and other people in the administration were very supportive of the operation. The press has fairly reported, I think, that the Panamanian people seem very happy with the operation. So I think it's an unfair statement to say that the press has tried to be overly critical of this operation. Certainly it is the press's responsibility to report when people who follow these things and know about them have criticisms or questions or doubts. It's also the responsibility of the press to report fairly what General Noriega's lawyers are saying, for instance, or what certain legal scholars are saying about problems this case has. So I think it's unfair to accuse the press of somehow defending Noriega or being too critical to the American government. I don't think that's the fact, and it's not fair criticism.
Our guest, Bob Parry, Washington correspondent for Newsweek magazine. He has a piece he wrote from Miami in this week's edition of Newsweek, and also he co-authored the cover story, which has the picture on the front page that was released by the government last week of General Noriega. Bob Parry, originally from Hartford, Connecticut, and with Newsweek magazine since February of '87, 12 years with the Associated Press. Thank you a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
To our audience, have a good day.
If you would like to contact our call-in guest, Robert Parry, you can write to him at the Washington Bureau of Newsweek. The address is 1750 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20006. Coming up next, former CBS News President Sig Mickelson discusses his book on television coverage of presidential campaigns.
Wednesday on C-SPAN, a look at the Census Bureau and the operations of the 1990 census. Wednesday beginning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, 6:30 a.m. Pacific Time.
Coming up next, we spend an hour with Sig Mickelson, former president of CBS News and author of the book From Whistle Stop to Soundbite, a look at television coverage of presidential campaigns. Mr. Mickelson is our guest this week on Book Notes.
Sig Mickelson, author of From Whistle Stop to Soundbite. I want to go to your last chapter first.
All right.
The Frustrated Dream, Chapter 12. What is your